In 1609, Galileo began to use the telescope, a newly invented instrument. And what he saw and wrote indicated that Aristotle had been mistaken in his basic ideas concerning the makeup of the universe. When the Roman Church attacked Galileo and Copernicus, it was not because their teaching contained anything contrary to the Bible, but Copernicus and Galileo's teaching did deny the Aristotelian elements which had become a part of the teaching of the Church. Copernicus taught that the earth went around the sun and not the sun around the earth. And Galileo defended the compatibility of Copernicus and the Bible. Condemned by the Roman Inquisition in 1632, Galileo was forced to back down. But his writings continued to testify not only that Copernicus was right, but that Aristotle was wrong. Blaise Pascal took a tube of mercury up a mountain and measured the changes in the mercury levels according to the altitude. In this way, he made the first successful barometer. Not only that, but some consider that he's the greatest writer of French prose who has ever lived. He did not see man lost like a speck of dust in the universe, which was so much larger and more complicated than men had thought. For man could comprehend the stars. The stars comprehended nothing. And beside this, for Pascal, man was special because Christ had died on the cross for him. What I have in my hand is not the proverbial apple that supposedly fell on Newton's head. What I have is a heavier object which would have knocked him out. As I take away my hand, it will fall to the ground. But listen, what was that second noise? Listen again. What you heard, of course, was an echo. Here at Cambridge University, Newton worked out the speed of sound by timing the interval of an echo over a known distance. He also came to the conclusion that there was a universal force of attraction between every body in the universe. He called this gravity. Newton's mathematical principles of natural philosophy became one of the most influential books in the history of human thought. It has been said that the 17th century scientists had an interest in the how, but not the why. Not true. For Newton and many scientists of that period, there was no problem concerning the why, because Newton began with the existence of a personal God who had created the universe. Newton had an intense interest in the Bible, because in his view, the same God who had created the universe gave men truth in the Bible. Newton and the other men of that period would have been utterly astounded at anyone who had an obsession with the how without having a professional interest in the why. Francis Bacon, lawyer, essayist, Lord Chancellor of England, stressed careful observation and systematic collection of information in order to unlock nature's secrets. He too took the Bible seriously, including the historic fall, the revolt of man in history.
Man, by the fall, fell at the same time from his state of innocence and from his dominion over creation. Both of these losses, however, can, even in this life, be in some parts repaired. The former by religion and faith, the latter by the arts and sciences.
To these founders of modern science, man, including his science, is not on his own. He is to take seriously the teaching of the Bible concerning history and the cosmos. And yet, art and science in themselves have value before man and God. This gave a strong impetus to the creative movings of science, not to be merely a passing thing, but to be continuous. God himself had given benevolent dominion over nature to men, and for Bacon, science had a part in this. To find out about the world was worthwhile because of men investigating God's marvelous creation. To quote Bacon again,
"Let no man out of weak conceit of sobriety, or in ill-applied moderation, think or maintain that a man can search too far or be too well studied in the book of God's Word, or in the book of God's works."
The book of God's Word is, of course, the Bible. The book of God's works is the universe which God had made. There was no separation between religious things and the arts and science. The tradition of Bacon and Newton was strongly maintained right up through the 19th century. The experimental physicist Michael Faraday was a Christian. He believed the secrets of God's creation are for all of us to enjoy. So he gave his famous public demonstrations. The physical world is an open book to explore because God gave it order and gave us the desire to investigate it, not just for a clever scientific elite, no, for all men. Not all the early scientists were individually consistent Christians. Many were, but all of them were living within the thought forms brought forth by Christianity. In this setting, man's creative stirrings had a base from which to continue and to develop. Knowing that the universe had been created by a reasonable God, the scientists, upon a Christian base, were able to move out with confidence, expecting to be able to find out about the universe by observation and experiment. Without this base, this foundation, modern Western science would never have been born. Without this base, Chinese science, though it had promising beginnings, never came to maturity. There was no confidence that the code of nature's laws could be unveiled and read, because there was no assurance that a divine being, even more rational than ourselves, had ever formulated such a code capable of being read. And this was said by Joseph Needham, an expert on this subject. The same thing could be said about Arab science. Without a Christian base, they lost their interest in science eventually. The Christian base, then, did not hinder science. The Christian base made modern science possible. In 1962, J. Robert Oppenheimer said that modern science was born out of the Christian life form. His field was that of atomic energy. He was also director for the Institute of Advanced Study at Princeton. Alfred North Whitehead, well-known mathematician and philosopher, said that Christianity was the mother of science. These views were held both by the pre-Reformation church and also in the teachings of the Reformers. Both held that the universe was created by God and that God is a reasonable God, as the Bible says he is. But we may ask, isn't science now in a new state, one in which the concept of an orderly universe is passé? It is often said that the worldview of relativity, that there are no absolute values and that everything is relative, is supported by Einstein's theory of relativity. But this is wrong. Einstein said that light travels at a constant speed in a vacuum everywhere in the universe. Therefore, nothing is less relative than the theory of relativity. Einstein himself was strongly opposed to this type of thinking.
I cannot believe that God plays dice with the cosmos.
We really do live in a cause and effect universe. If this space vehicle is to fly, it must be constructed according to the existing order of the universe. When something happens, No matter what we may say we believe, we look for something that happened previously as an explanation. If this were not possible, nothing could be explained, and science could not be applied with reliability. Because we live in a universe where cause produces effect, this space vehicle can fly thousands of miles and land exactly on target. You see cause. The flight of the spacecraft is charted. Effect. It lands where it is supposed to. We know we live in a universe that is much more complex than men, including scientists, once thought it to be. But that is a far cry from the concept of a random universe. What view of the universe did Galileo, Newton, Faraday, and others who shared a Christian base have? They held that the universe was an open universe because God and man are not a part of an all-inclusive cosmic machine. There is something profound in this. The machine, whether it is the cosmic machine or a machine which men make, is not a master nor a threat because the machine does not include everything. There is a place for man to be man. Later, when the Christian base was lost, the mechanical laws of cause and effect, which had been applied to chemistry, to astronomy, and to physics, were now applied equally to man and to society. The earlier scientists, the founders of modern science, would not have accepted this concept. With it, immediately there was no place for God, but equally no place for man as man. Man died, and love died. There is no place for love in a totally closed cause and effect system. And there is no place for morals. And there is no place for the freedom of man. There is no place for the significance of man. Man becomes a zero. Life becomes pointless, devoid of meaning. The older idea of man as someone observing nature was undermined by the idea that man is something to be observed, as no different from all of nature. Darwin, in his Origin of the Species, claimed that all life evolved from more simple forms through survival of the fittest. The concept of an unbroken line from the molecule to man, merely on the basis of time and chance, does not answer either of the two questions of the how or the why which occupied Newton and Bacon. Murray Eden, professor of MIT, has made statistical studies which indicate that pure chance could not have produced the biological complexity of the world out of chaos in any amount of time suggested so far. Scientific Research magazine has discussed Murray Eden's work in an article entitled "Mathematicians Question Darwinism." Has there been enough time for natural selection, as is seen through the eyepieces of Darwinism or neo-Darwinism, to operate and give rise to the observed phenomena of nature? No, say these mathematicians. No one has shown how man could have come from non-man on the basis of time and chance. Tragically, after one has accepted the concept of the survival of the fittest, all restraints are removed. This opened the door for 20th century racism to be sanctioned and made respectable in the name of science. When biblical Christianity ceased to provide the consensus for German society, when political and economic chaos, as well as moral permissiveness, prevailed, the stage was set for the Nazi movement. Heinrich Himmler who was the head of the Gestapo, stated the law of nature must take its course in the survival of the fittest. Hitler stated numerous times that Christianity and its concept of charity should be replaced by the ethic of strength over weakness, the survival of the fittest. There were many factors in the rise of National Socialism in Germany, but in that setting, the evolutionary survival of the fittest concept sanctioned what occurred. Humanism had set out to make man autonomous, and it turned out poorly. In a quieter way, and yet importantly, some of today's advocates of genetic engineering use exactly the same arguments to put forth their position. They say that genetic engineering ought to be used for the survival of the fittest, rather than medical advances being used to keep the weak alive, to be the producers of the next generation. When the Christian consensus died, it left a vacuum, and this will tend to be filled by an elite to form an authoritarian state. When we speak of an authoritarian state, we must not think of the model of Hitler or Stalin, but rather a manipulative authoritarian state. The governments of the world have at their disposal forms of manipulation beyond anything the world has ever known before. Organ transplants are a helpful breakthrough, and we can be glad for it. But to get the needed kidneys and other organs for transplants, the surgeon naturally has to await the donor's death. The accepted definition of death used to be the cessation of heartbeat and breathing. Now the definition is a flat brain wave. This is not wrong in itself, but it opens the door to harvesting the dead. With the brain wave flat, these bodies could be kept alive indefinitely to harvest their blood, to harvest their organs, for transplants, and for experimentation. Without the absolute line which Christianity gives of man being totally unique, things which are good in themselves can lead to an increasing loss of humanness. For modern man, there is no boundary line between what he should do and what he should not do. And this leaves him with what he can do. Any moral ought is only what is sociologically accepted at the moment. Now, as a Christian, I have a reference point in the Bible. I have a reference point by what it teaches. And in this way, I have something to judge things by. But on the other hand, if I am left without any fixed point by which to judge things, without any cubbyholes, as it were, to fit the thoughts that are being thrown at me, I have no basis of judgment at all. I'm just left naked before these things that are thrown at me with no possible way of making a critical analysis. Many couples today cannot have children because of a low sperm count on the part of the husband. This can often be cured by artificial insemination using the husband's sperm. This is called AIH, H standing for the husband. This is surely a help to many couples. There then comes AID, sperm by a donor, another man. Where is the boundary line? Where does adultery begin? At present in Britain, such a child would be considered illegitimate. In the book, Our Future Inheritance, Choice or Chance, it is written, perhaps the most sensible suggestion made is that the concept of legitimacy be removed altogether. This is not only a change of morals, but a weakening of the family. They make this change upon the basis of what they call social hindrance. It is what I call sociological law. We would all be glad to see the genetic diseases cured. But once the borderlines are removed, which are based upon the biblical absolutes, then humanness can be and is lost increasingly. And increasingly, full genetic engineering is accepted, and so is control. It is B.F. Skinner's thesis that all the people are is the result of conditioning by society, and that through positive reinforcers, society should make people into what it wants them to be. George T. Harris, in Psychology Today, says, nobody would panic at Skinner's attack upon our idea of freedom if he were only talking, but he has a program and followers to push it. Such behaviors are often found where it counts. At times, they control education in the schools, down to the lowest grades. With all forms of determinism, man as man dies. The determinist has no way to derive his values from what exists, and hence his values and his morals must be chosen arbitrarily. Once this way of thinking is accepted, it is much easier to impose arbitrary absolutes. To quote B.F. Skinner, to man as man, we readily say, good riddance. I think we'd have to say, and it's not tried at all, though it's often been said, that science has become our new religion. We have been conditioned to accept the objectivity of the scientists without realizing that often their views are very clearly shaped by their philosophy or by their worldview. And therefore, having accepted this objectivity almost blindly and having it driven into us, whether it would be the more exact sciences, for instance, astronomy or chemistry or physics, or what now is accepted as almost exact sciences of sociology and psychology, having been accepted, having been conditioned to accept these things, people just stop listening. They just take what they're told without any critical analysis. It is well known that in Russia, political prisoners are put into mental institutions to be reconditioned, and thus they lose their civil rights and they become non-persons. But conditioning does not have to be so crude in order to be effective. In the West, the flood of books and articles and ideas about psychological, sociological, and chemical determinism has opened the way for the acceptance of first the idea and then the practice of manipulation. People have been increasingly conditioned to be treated as machines and to treat other people as machines. And the technical breakthroughs have largely been made for manipulation. No less a person than Arthur Kessler, the noted scientist and author, has suggested that a chemical agent be developed to rid men of aggression and give him tranquility. In other words, a super tranquilizer. Just like those who wanted to put LSD into the water supply, he suggested that some community may put it in its drinking water so that everyone could get the effects of it. In this section, I'm giving that which has been reported in various newspapers and news magazines. Kenneth B. Clark, one-time president of the American Psychological Association, suggested in 1971 that all political leaders should have to take anti-aggression pills so they could not be aggressive. And the head of the gynecology and obstetrics department of the Kansas City University Medical School, Dr. Kermit Cranty, urged that birth control pills be put into the world's drinking supplies to control population. And some have suggested that the state could dispense yet another drug to certain households to neutralize the pill. This way the state could decide who could have babies and who could not. Russell V. Lee, clinical professor emeritus of Stanford University Medical School, said that all public officials should have to have psychological annual testing in depth. And in the case of a high federal official. If the committee thinks it's necessary, the findings could be turned over to a congressional committee who would have the power to remove the official from office. One little thing: the men who dispense the pills and who do the psychological testing will be king. Who will control the controllers? And what will happen now that the line between what man should do and what he can do is obliterated? And if man is only a conditioned machine, what is the value of the continuation of mankind? The thing that made the difference between the view of the early scientists and that which marks man today, who sees man as being only a part of a cosmic machine, is not something science has demonstrated. It simply was a shift in the philosophic outlook of the scientists, turning away from the early base that science had of the world having been created by a reasonable God. And the only way that we could return would be to go back to that which the early scientists believed: a God who exists and is not silent. And he's spoken in a way that people can understand in the Bible and in the revelation in Christ. And in the Bible and in the revelation of Christ, we have truth that gives us the key of the whole of life. It tells us the origin of the universe, why it has form. It tells us why man is great, as made in the image of God. It tells us why man is cruel, because he has turned away from God as his integration point and put himself at the center, the fall. It gives us all these things. And then, of course, it gives us also a basis in its absolute teaching for both morals and law. The history of the non-Christian philosophers up until the 18th century went like this. Here is a circle which stands for what the unified and true knowledge of the universe is. Then the next man would say no and cross out the circle. But he then would say, here is the circle. And the next man would say no and cross out that circle. Then he would make his circle. And the next man would cross it out and make his circle. This continued through the centuries. They never found the circle, but they optimistically believed someone would, beginning only from man himself and on the basis of man's reasoning alone. Then the endless row of circles through the centuries and the crossing out was broken. And a drastic shift came because the humanistic ideal had failed. Humanistic man gave up his optimism for pessimism. He gave up the hope of a unified answer. And this makes modern man who he is. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, philosopher from Geneva. He lived in the 18th century. He thought primitive man, the noble savage, to be superior to civilized man. He felt that the Enlightenment, with its emphasis on reason, the arts and the sciences caused man to lose more than he gained. Rousseau saw the constraints of civilization as evils.
L'homme est né libre, et cependant, partout il est dans les fers.
Man was born free, but everywhere he is in chains. He demanded not just freedom from God or the Bible, but freedom from any kind of restraint. Freedom from culture, freedom from authority, absolute freedom for the individual, with the individual at the center of the universe. When applied to the individual, his concept led to the bohemian ideal, where the hero was the man who fought all standards and all values and all restraints of society. When Rousseau applied his concept of autonomous freedom to society, his concept would not function. Whosoever refuses to obey the general will shall be compelled to do so by the whole body. Rousseau wrote this in 1762. This means nothing less than that he will be forced to be free. In other words, tyranny, a tyranny that carried his position to its logical conclusion in the reign of terror of the French Revolution. Robespierre, the king of the terror, genuinely saw himself putting Rousseau's ideas into practice. Paul Gauguin was a follower of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. In his hunt for total freedom, he deserted his family. He went to Tahiti, hoping to find there the noble savage. And there he found the ideal of the noble savage to be an illusion. As he worked on this painting, he also wrote about it. He called it a philosophical work comparable to the gospel. But what a gospel. Gauguin himself said,
"Close to the death of an old woman, a strange, stupid bird concludes. Whence? What? Whither? O sorrow, thou art my master. Fate, how cruel thou art, and always vanquished. I revolt."
What he found in Tahiti was death and cruelty. The man is good by nature, as Rousseau claimed, is no more true of primitive man than of civilized man. When Gauguin finished this painting, he tried to commit suicide, but he did not succeed. There was one man who well understood the logical conclusion of the deification of nature, the Marquis de Sade. If nature is all, then what is right. and nothing more can be said. As nature has made us, the men, the strongest we can do with her, the woman, whatever we please. The inevitable result was his cruelty to women. Thus, there was no basis for either morals or law. Let me dwell for a moment on the Dutch Reformation painters, who so rejoicingly painted the simple things of life. They knew that nature was created by a personal and a good God. But they also knew, because of the fall, man's revolt against God, that nature as it is now is abnormal. That is a very different thing than taking nature as it is now and making it the measure of goodness. Because when this is done, there is no difference between cruelty and non-cruelty. Even at the time of Rousseau and his followers, the two concepts of total freedom and of everything, including man, being part of one big machine, could no longer be kept together. Rousseau's position of man's total freedom collides with the position that on the basis of man's reason alone, everything, including man, is part of one big machine. The two positions just couldn't be kept united. Later, the German philosophers Immanuel Kant and George Wilhelm Hegel and the Danish Søren Kierkegaard wrestled with the problem of a unity of reason on one hand, and on the other hand, meaning and values. But they did not solve the problem. Humanistic man, beginning only from himself, has concluded that he is only a machine. Humanistic man has no place for a personal God, but there is also no place for man's significance as man, no place for love, no place for freedom. Man is only a machine, but the men who hold this position could not and cannot live like machines. If they could, modern man would not have his tensions, either in his intellectual position or in his life. But he can't. And so they must leap away from reason to try to find something which gives meaning to their lives, to life itself, even though to do so, they deny their reason. Once this is done, any type of thing could be put there. Because in the area of non-reason, reason gives no basis for a choice. This is the hallmark of modern man. How did it happen? It happened because proud, humanistic man, though he was finite, insisted in beginning only from himself and from what he could learn without other knowledge. He did not succeed. Perhaps the best known of the existential philosophers was Jean-Paul Sartre. He used to spend much time here in Paris at the Durmago. His position is that in the area of reason, everything is absurd, but that one can authenticate himself, that is, give validity to his existence by an act of the will. With Sartre's position, one can equally help an old woman across the street.
Merci, monsieur. Oh, ben, vous savez de nos jours, hein? Merci, monsieur. Merci beaucoup.
Or run her down. Reason was not involved, and there was nothing to show the direction that this authentication by an act of the will should take. But Sartre himself could not live consistently with his own position.
Adressé au président du tribunal international sur les crimes de guerre par le président Ho Chi Minh.
At a certain point, he signed the Algerian Manifesto, which declared that the Algerian War was a dirty war. This action meant man could use his reason to decide some things were right and some things were wrong, and so he destroyed his own system.
Au moment où les impérialistes américains intensifient à outrance l'escalade.
Karl Jaspers, a German existentialist, tended to have the greatest impact on the thought and life form which followed existential thought. According to him, we may have some huge experience, which gives us the hope that perhaps there is a meaning to life, even though our reason tells us that life is absurd. He calls this a final experience. Martin Heidegger was another existential philosopher who said that the answer was in the area of non-reason. The German philosopher said there is something he called angst, a general feeling of anxiety one feels in the universe. This feeling, this mood of anxiety, revealed existence, and this imposes on us a call for decision. Out of this mood comes meaning to life and to choice, even against one's reason. Meaning which rests on nothing more than this vague feeling of anxiety, so nebulous it doesn't even have a specific object. As Martin Heidegger grew older, this view became too weak for him, so he changed his position. Existentialism as a form of philosophy has all but disappeared, but more and more people are thinking this way, even if they do not know the name existentialism. To them, reason leads to pessimism, and so they try to find an answer in something totally separated from reason. Aldous Huxley, the English philosopher and writer, proposed drugs as a solution. According to him, we should give drugs to healthy people. By means of the drug experience, they could then find truth inside their own heads anytime they wished. What was left for Huxley and his followers was truth inside man's own head. To them, objective truth was gone. The drug culture and the mentality that went with it had its own vehicle which crossed the frontiers of the world, which were otherwise almost impassable by other means of communication. This record became the rallying cry of many of the young people throughout the whole world. It expressed the essence of their lives, their thoughts, and their feelings. Later came psychedelic rock, an attempt to find this experience without drugs. The younger people and the older ones tried drug taking, but then turned to the Eastern religions. Both drugs and the Eastern religions seek truth inside one's own head, in negation of reason. The central reason for the popularity of Eastern religions in the West is a hope for non-rational meaning to life and values. The reason young people turn to the Eastern religions and so on is simply the fact, as we have said, and that is that man having moved into the area of non-reason, you can put anything up there. And the heart of the Eastern religion is a denial of reason, just exactly as the idealistic drug taking was. And so the turning to the Eastern religions today fits exactly into the modern existential methodology, the existential thinking of modern man, of trying to find some optimistic hope in the area of non-reason when he's given up hope on a humanistic basis of finding any kind of unifying answer to life, any meaning to life in the answer of reason. Though demons do not fit into modern man's conclusions on the basis of his reason, many modern people feel that even demons are better than everything in the universe, being only one big machine. People put the occult in the area of non-reason, in the hope of some kind of meaning, even if it is a horrendous kind of meaning. One must feel as a Christian a real sorrow for these people. But as far as the blame is concerned, we must understand these people who have turned to this are not to blame. They must bear their own kind of blame of individual choices. But basically, they're not to blame. The church is to blame, because the church, with its liberal theology, has left a vacuum. Man, beginning from himself alone, was now expressed and taught in theology and in theological language. In the Renaissance, men had attempted to mix Aristotle and Plato with Christianity. This new theology was an attempt to combine the rationalism of the Enlightenment with Christianity. It is often called religious liberalism. It was embarrassed by the supernatural and often denied it entirely. For example, the resurrection of Christ from the dead. But it tried to hold on to a historical Jesus by sifting out from the New Testament all those supernatural elements which the New Testament taught about Jesus. This attempt came to a climax with Albert Schweitzer's famous book, Quest of the Historical Jesus. It failed. It failed to rid the New Testament account of the supernatural and still keep an historic Christ. The historic Jesus could not be separated from the supernatural events connected with him in the New Testament. History and the supernatural are too interwoven in the New Testament. If one kept any of the historical Jesus, one had to keep some of the supernatural. If one got rid of all the supernatural, one had no historical Jesus. We should remember Schweitzer's humanitarianism in Africa, his genius as an organist, and his expertise concerning Bach. But unhappily, we must remember his place in the theological stream as well. After the failure of the older theological liberalism, Karl Barth stepped into the vacuum. He held the higher critical views concerning the Bible. That is, that the Bible has many mistakes. But he taught that a religious word could break through from it. This was the theological form of existentialism after existentialism had been accepted in its secular form. Thus, one more thing was added to the area of non-reason, along with all the other things that had been put there. In another way, we must have admiration for the Swiss Karl Barth, because while he was teaching in Germany, he spoke out clearly against Nazism in his Barmen Declaration of 1934. The teaching of Barth led to those theologians who said that the Bible isn't true in the areas of science and history. But they nevertheless looked for a religious experience from it. And for many adherents of this theology, the Bible does not give absolutes in regard to what is right or wrong either. Before you even come to the Bible and begin to read it, one must realize there are two ways to read the Bible. One is just one more religious thing among thousands of other religious things, which really are nothing more than another form of trip, not very, very different actually from a drug trip. The other way is to understand that the Bible is truth. And as such, what we're listening to is something that is completely contrary to what we hear about us on every side, namely merely statistical averages, relativistic things. Now, having said this, then I'd have to guard myself for the simple reason that it doesn't mean a person has to believe all this before he can begin to read the Bible and find truth in the Bible. I would just say in passing, I was not raised in a Christian family, and I was reading much philosophy when I was a young man, and I didn't read the Bible because I believed it was true. I read it just simply out of an intellectual honesty. But I did do one thing. I read it exactly the way it was written. Beginning with Genesis 1:1 and going right on, I read it the same way I would read another book, expecting that what was being given was a straightforward statement of what was meant, and that it wasn't to be read in a different level than I would read in the area of another kind of book. And as I read it, it answered the questions which already by that time I realized that humanistic philosophy couldn't answer. And over a 6-month period, I came to conclude that it was truth. But nevertheless, we must keep in the back of our mind, how are we reading the Bible? Just as another religious trip? Or am I really wrestling with the question of what is given in all the areas of which it speaks? Is this truth and compared to merely relativism? The new liberal theologian has no answer for the existence of evil, and thus they're left with the same problem as the Hindu philosophers. Everything that is a part of God. This is Kali, the Eastern Hindu feminine representation of God. Why the fangs and the skulls? In Eastern religious thought, cruelty is ultimately the same as non-cruelty, because everything that now is part of that which has always been, a part of what they call God. Modern humanistic man has come to the same awful place, a place in which it is not possible to know what is right and what is wrong, nor why we should choose non-cruelty rather than cruelty. Professor Paul Tillich of Harvard was one of the outstanding neo-Orthodox liberal theologians. A student who was present told me that when Professor Tillich was lecturing in Santa Barbara just before his death, someone said to him, "Sir, do you pray?" And he said, "No, but I meditate." He was left only with the word God, with no certainty that there was anything more than just a word. The God is dead theologians, which followed Tillich, concluded logically that if they are only left with the word God, they might as well cross out the word. But for these theologians, even if they do not say God is dead, for them certain things are dead. All content about God is dead, and all assurance of knowledge about a personal God is dead. Because for them, God has not given to people truth about himself in the Bible and in the revelation in Christ. That is, truth about himself which may be expressed in propositions in normal language. All they're left with is religious words without content, but with that emotion that certain religious words still brings with them, and that is all. And here is what comes next. These highly motivational religious words out of our religious past, but separated from the content which the Bible originally gave them, are now used for manipulation. Manipulation in such areas as a change in sexual ethic, but also legal and political manipulation. If God is dead, if content about God is dead, if the knowledge of a personal God who has not been silent but has given us truth is dead, then everything for which God gives an answer and meaning is dead as well. And yet, people, no matter who they say they are, cry out for meaning and values. And this place of tension is where modern man has come upon his humanist base. And this is where he is. When we think of Christ, of course we think of his substitutionary death upon the cross. When he who claimed to be God died in a substitutionary way. And as such, his death had infinite value. And as we accept that gift, raising the empty hands of faith and accepting it with no humanistic elements, we have that which is real life, and that is in being in relationship to the infinite personal God who is there, and in being in a personal relationship to him. But Christ brings life in another way that often is not as clearly thought about, perhaps, and that is that he connects himself with what the Bible teaches in his teaching. And as such, he is a prophet as well as a savior. And it's upon the basis of what he taught and the Bible teaches, because he himself wraps these together, that we have life instead of death, in the sense of having some knowledge that is more than man can have from himself, beginning from himself alone. Both of these elements are the place where Christ gives us life. Monet, Renoir, Pissarro, Sisley, and Degas were following nature, as it was then called, in their painting. They were impressionists. They painted only what their eyes brought them. But was there reality behind the light waves reaching their eyes? After 1885, Monet carried this to its conclusion, and reality tended to become a dream. With Impressionism, the door was opened for art to become the vehicle for modern thought. As reality became a dream, Impressionism began to fall apart. These men, Cézanne, Van Gogh, Gauguin, Seurat, all great post-Impressionists, felt the problem, felt the loss of meaning. They set out to solve the problem, to find the way back to the reality, to the absolute, behind the individual things, behind the particulars. Ultimately, they failed. I am not saying that these painters were always consciously painting their philosophy of life, but rather that in their work as a whole, their worldview was often reflected. Cézanne reduced nature to what he considered its basic geometric forms. In this, he was searching for a universal which would tie all kinds of individual things in nature together. But this gave a broken, fragmented appearance to his pictures. In his bathers, there is much freshness, much vitality, an absolute wonder in the balance of the picture as a whole. But he portrayed not only nature, but man himself in fragmented form. I want to stress that I'm not minimizing these men as men, To read Van Gogh's letters is to weep for the pain of the sensitive man. Nor do I minimize their talent as painters. Their work often has great beauty indeed. But their art did become the vehicle of modern man's view of fractured truth and life. As philosophy had moved from unity to fragmentation, so did painting. In 1912, Kandinsky wrote an article saying that insofar as the old harmony, that is, a unity of knowledge, had been lost, that only two possibilities remained: extreme abstraction or extreme naturalism. Both, he said, were equal. With this painting, modern art was born. Picasso painted it in 1907 and called it Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. It unites Cézanne's fragmentation with Gauguin's concept of the noble savage, using the form of the African mask, which was popular with the Parisian art circle of that time. In great art, technique is united with worldview. And the technique of fragmentation fits well with the worldview of modern man. A view of a fragmented world and fragmented man, and a complete break with the art of the Renaissance, which was founded on man's humanist hopes. Here, man is made to be less than man. Humanity is lost. Speaking of a part of Picasso's private collection of his own works, David Douglas Duncan says, "Of course, not one of these pictures was actually a portrait, but his prophecy of a ruined world. But Picasso himself could not live with this loss of the human. When he was in love with Olga and later Jacqueline, he did not consistently paint them in a fragmented way. At crucial points of their relationship, he painted them as they really were, with all his genius, with all their humanity. When he was painting his own young children, he did not use fragmented techniques and presentation. I want you to understand that I am not saying that gentleness and humanness are never present in modern art. But as the techniques of modern art advanced, humanity was increasingly fragmented." The opposite of fragmentation would be unity. And the old philosophic thinkers thought they could bring forth this unity from a humanist base. And then they gave this up. And the modern thinking has accepted fragmentation as a defeat, really. A defeat that human mentality, beginning from itself, can bring forth a unity of thought and of life. Now, by unity, what we mean is that which would include all of thought and all of life. And it can be achieved if indeed God has spoken and has not been silent. And in giving us the facts that man couldn't find for himself, there is a unity inside of which all that marvelous diversity, which then man can study, has a unified place, whether it's in knowledge or in values and in life. It was Dadaism which carried the concept of everything being a matter of chance to its logical conclusion, of the ultimate absurdity of everything, including humanity. This is Marcel Duchamp's Nude Descending a Staircase. Duchamp perhaps understood most clearly and consciously the absurdity of all things, including man, on the basis of modern man's worldview. Here he carried fragmentation further. The human being disappeared completely. He realized that this absurdity of all things included the absurdity of art itself. This is one of his ready-mades. He took any object near at hand and simply signed it. The philosophers from Rousseau, Kant, Hegel, and Kierkegaard onward had given up a hope of a unity of life and of knowledge, and had come to a fragmented concept of reality. Then the painters painted that way. However, the artists, being sensitive men, came more quickly to the understanding of what the end of this view would be, and that is that all things are absurd. The American Jackson Pollock is perhaps the clearest example of deliberately painting in a way that says all is chance. This is how Pollock went about creating some of his art. Thus, his paintings were a product of chance. But wait, is there not order in these lines of paint? Yes, because you see, it is not really chance that shaped his canvases. The universe is not a random universe. It has order. The movement of this swinging can of paint follows the order of the universe itself. The universe is not what these painters said it is. It was a bankrupt humanistic philosophy which first taught that reason leads to pessimism and that optimism is only to be found in the area of non-reason. This basic idea filtered down to art and then to classical music and later to popular music. It started with Beethoven's Last Quartets. You could not call these modern, but there was a shift from the previous music. In France, Claude Debussy opened the door for modern music. Many of us have a profound admiration for his music and enjoy it very much indeed. But Debussy did open the door, not to non-resolution, as the German composers did, but to fragmentation, a fragmentation parallel to the fragmentation in painting. A fragmentation which was a great influence on almost all the following composers of classical music, as well as the later forms of jazz and rock. In Germany, after Beethoven's quartets, came Wagner and Mahler, then Schoenberg with his 12-tone row. Here's perpetual variation, but never resolution. This is Karl-Heinz Stockhausen. You're listening to the published score of electronic music. Concern with the element of chance was part of Stockhausen's work. This ties him in with John Cage. Cage believed the universe is a universe of chance. To express this, he produced music by chance. Cage's music turned out to be sheer noise. Significantly, he entitled this composition, Music for Marcel Duchamp. John Cage was another one who could not live with his concept of a chance universe because it does not fit the universe which exists. Cage was an expert in the knowledge of mushrooms. He himself said, "I became aware that if I approached mushrooms in the spirit of my chance operation, I would die shortly." His theory of the universe did not fit the universe that exists. Why is the airplane carefully formed and orderly, and what Cage produced is utter noise? Because the airplane must fly in the universe that exists, and there are orderly flow lines in the universe that exists. The universe is not what Pollock in his paintings and Cage in his music said it was. And because Cage's music does not fit what man is either, it had to become increasingly spectacular to keep us interested. Hey! What a contrast to Bach, who had much diversity and yet always resolution. Bach, as a Christian, believed that there was resolution for the individual and for history. As the music that came out of the biblical teaching of the Reformation was influenced by that worldview, so the worldview of modern man shapes modern music. Is this still art? Is it not rather a bare philosophic intellectual statement, separated from the fullness of who man is and what the universe is, tending to be only a bare intellectual statement rather than a work of art? It often has become anti-art art. After philosophy, art, and music, poetry, the novel, and drama became the vehicle for these ideas. In the English-speaking world, T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland came first.
Le Prince d'Aquitaine à la Tour Abolique. These fragments I have shored against my ruin. Why, then I'll fit you. Hieronymo's mad again. Data, Dayadvam, Damyata. Shanti, Shanti, Shanti.
You see, he matches a fragmented message with a fragmented form of poetry. Just as Picasso opened the way for a fragmented concept of life in Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, so fragmented poetry in the English-speaking world began with T.S. Eliot's Wasteland. Later, Eliot became a Christian, and his form of writing changed from that of the Wasteland. More and more, philosophy was expressed, not as formal statements of philosophy as such, but rather in the novel and other art forms. Sartre wrote Nausea, Camus, The Stranger, and The Plague, and Simone de Beauvoir, L'Invité. In the 60s, many of the basic philosophic statements were made through the cinema. And being carried by the cinema, they reached a far wider circle of people than had ever been the case through painting or literature, let alone through the writings of the philosophers. Among these films were Silence and the Hour of the Wolf by Bergman, Juliet of the Spirits by Fellini, Blow Up by Antonioni, Belle de Jour by Buñuel. They showed pictorially and with great force what it is like if people are only machines, and also what it is like if people try to live in the area of non-reason. In the area of non-reason, there is no way to distinguish between right and wrong, or even between what is objectively true and that which is illusion or fantasy. A good example is Antonioni's Blow Up. The advertisement for the film reads, "Murder without guilt, love without meaning." In this film, there are no certainties concerning moral values and no human categories either. Blow Up has no hero. All one has is Antonioni's non-hero. All there is the camera, which just goes click, 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 and the human factor has disappeared. Some of the films of that period went even further. The Last Year of Marienbad, Juliet of the Spirits, The Hour of the Wolf, Belle de Jour. They were saying something even more profound. They were saying that as modern man leaps into the area of non-reason to try to find his optimism without reason, that he not only does not have any categories for moral or human values, but he does not have any certainty upon which to distinguish between reality and illusion.
Picture has a realistic line. They are no dreams. They are
fantasies of the spirit. There's no difference between the dream and the reality.
Pronti a poco. Marisa, quando prendi mettete un po' di fantasia in quello che fate, poi mi devo dire tutto millimetro per millimetro. E là.
It is my only way to live in reality. You know, it's for a creature. I think that what he does is only reality.
E urlate l'altalena dell'amore, tante volte dovete dire l'altalena dell'amore. Pronto? Come on!
To don't give meaning to the reality means that you don't understand no more reality. And reality can appear also like a monstrum, things without any meaning.
Bergman was a clear case at this point. He directed The Hour of the Wolf, where one cannot tell the difference between what is real and what is fantasy. Was what was being presented really happening, or was it in the mind of one of the characters? If people begin only from themselves and think that they live in a universe in which there is no personal God to speak, a universe such as Bergman indicated in his film Silence, then they have no final way to distinguish between reality and fantasy or illusion. But Bergman, like Sartre and Camus, could not live consistently with his own position, and therefore the background music for the film Silence is Bach's Goldberg variations. Bergman said, "There's a small, holy part of the human being where music speaks." Bergman also said that while he was writing the script for the film Silence, that he had the music of Bach's Goldberg variations playing in his home, and the music interfered with that which was being set forth in that film. The Christian knows why music speaks. He knows the people are not a product of chance. The people are made in the image of God. And on this basis, it is understandable that music is music to man. And because God has spoken in the Bible, there is not silence. And there are certainties concerning moral values and human values. And there are categories upon which to distinguish between reality and fantasy. For the people with the humanist position, this is not so. Within the humanist position, there is no base for knowing. Christianity is not romantic. The Bible's not romantic about man. Man is seen as fallen. Man is seen as rebellion. Man is seen as rebellious against God, with all the goodness of God and with all the knowledge he has, on one hand from the surrounding universe and its form and the mannishness of man, and on the other hand from the more detailed knowledge of the Bible and the revelation in Christ. Man is a rebel. And we know Christian does not romantically think that this can be just leapt over. But having said that, a Christian is not a pessimist. He's not a pessimist on two levels. First of all, history's going someplace. And a part of the Christian message is that Christ is coming back. And this is the final solution. But every Christian who really understands the Scripture, also every generation, he is waiting and fighting and struggling and doing all that he can, not only to see individuals become Christians, but the culture touched by these individual Christians. Modern man's humanistic thought has come down in many, many forms until at a certain point of history, now I would put it in the early 1960s, people heard this same message coming at them from absolutely every side. Whether they read the book of philosophy, or they went into the art museum, or they listened to music, or they read a modern novel, or they went to the philosophic cinema, it was always the same. And that is that on the humanistic basis, reason leads to despair, to no answers. And people should try to find answers in the area of non-reason. It had brought people to the place where there were no fixed values whatsoever. These were completely gone. And the great majority of people had come to the place where they had only two horrendous values, absolutely horrible values: personal peace and affluence. Now, because I'm going to use these terms over and over again in this episode, let me define them carefully, and I'd urge you, please listen with care. As I use the term personal peace, I mean I want to be left alone. And I don't care what happens to the man across the street or across the world. I want my own lifestyle to be undisturbed, regardless of what it will mean even to my own children and grandchildren. Now that's what I mean by personal peace. Affluence means things, 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 always more things, and success seen as an abundance of things. In the early 60s, a whole generation had been injected by the teaching that reason leads only to pessimism in the area of a meaning of life and of any values. Students have been hearing this from the professors for a long, long time.
Understood, interpreted. One, therefore, is...
As a matter of fact, there was a generation that had never been taught anything else. But there was an inconsistency here, because most of these professors who taught that life had no meaning and there were no fixed values, they didn't live that way. They were living in the memory of the past. But we should not have been surprised that at a certain point of time, one generation would act, really act, upon what they had been taught. These students looked around them, and they saw these two horrible values of personal peace and affluency being on every side, and they revolted. And that revolution was Berkeley, 1964. Looking back into that which is now past history, we don't understand where we are today unless we take a moment to understand the flow through Berkeley of 1964. They really wanted to escape the two values of personal peace and affluency. And they did it in two different ways. First of all came the drug scene, the hippie scene. And we've already seen in a previous episode that Aldous Huxley said that as reason humanistic reason doesn't give a meaning to life, and we can't find objective truth, give drugs to well people in order that they might try to find truth inside of their own head. The hippie world followed this, and they followed it very explicitly. It was an ideology to them. Let's not make any mistake. Back in those days, it was really an ideology. They really believed in it. They really believed that if you could just take and put drugs into the drinking water, LSD, into the drinking water of the reservoirs of the cities of the world, and you had enough people turned on, that civilization's problems would be solved. They believed it with all their heart.
Getting high with the help of your friends. It's a very powerful message.
About the same time at Berkeley, there arose a second element in this attempt to escape these two terrible values of personal peace and affluency. This was the free speech movement. At first, the free speech movement on Sproul Plaza was neither left nor right. It was simply a desire, a demand that they have a right to have freedom, to have political rallies on Sproul Plaza.
And by God, people, we have to push Reagan right back to the wall, and if we have to, we got to push him right through the wall. And we got to tell him, no, baby, this is our university.
But quickly, it slipped into the New Left, following Marcuse. Marcuse was a German philosopher, a Marxist, and at that time he was teaching at San Diego. This spread over the whole world. We can think, for example, of the Paris riots in 1968. Here they are seeking freedom from these two values. They had the right analysis. Let me say that as somebody who was older. They had the right analysis. This was where our society was, with just two terrible values of personal peace and fluency. But the tragedy was they tried the wrong solutions. The drug culture came to its height at Woodstock at the festival there in 1969. But in Altima, in 1969, there was another festival, and the Hells Angels, who were hired to police the ground, killed at least one man. And the Rolling Stone, the magazine, came out and quoted someone after that as saying, "We've lost our age of innocency." The drug culture was finished. It was completely finished after the Isle of Wight Festival in 1970, which ended so ugly, in such an ugly fashion in Europe. After that, drug-taking changed. Mind you, not less people taking drugs unhappily, but no longer taking them as an ideology. The unhappy thing is probably more people are taking drugs and taking them at a younger age. But drug-taking as an ideology was absolutely done. The New Left went the same way, gradually ground down. It brought forth naturally violence. Violence in the United States, violence in Europe. And the idealistic young people really didn't like the violence that it just reasonably and naturally brought forth. In 1970, the radical students bombed the University of Wisconsin lab building, killing a graduate student. Bombs continue to be planted in the United States, and a small, hard core of radicals continues to exist. But the violence of the New Left, climaxing in the bombing of this laboratory building, made most young people in the United States no longer see the New Left as a hope. So here the students were, and they had tried to escape these two awful values of personal peace and fluency, and now their two hopes, the New Left and the drug thing, was gone. What were they left with? And they were left with apathy. Apathy. Many, many people were so glad when the universities quieted down at that time. And in one way, it's good. It did quiet down. But I could have wept, and I did weep as I met these young people after this. All they had left was apathy. And they had tried to escape their parents' poor values or society's poor values, and they'd gone around in a circle and come back and ended 1 inch lower. And now apathy ruled with them, and what was left? The two values of personal peace and fluency now ruled supreme. Now, turning away from the United States, a dominant, strong minority in Europe and a majority of students, for example, let's say in South America and other parts of the world, they turned to a new leap into the area of non-reason. And that is, they committed themselves to the Marxist, Leninist, or the Maoist line. Why is this a new kind of leap into the area of non-reason, as utopian in a bad sense as the old drug leap? Well, I'll tell you why. It's simply because everywhere where Marxian Leninism has come to power, it has always meant oppression. Always. And these young people just close their eyes to that. They close their eyes to the fact that oppression is a part of the communistic system.
Бережность, и я бы сказал, та нежность.
No one has pointed this out more to us than Solzhenitsyn in his emphasis, as he's brought it into the Western world in his writings and lecturings. And he has said that 15 million inmates of the prison camps existed at one time in Soviet Russia. He has said that from the communist revolution in Russia until only 1959, 66 million people died for political reason. So everywhere one looks in the communist world, it always brings forth internal oppression. But we must never forget, it also brings forth external oppression. We could think of various things, but the thing which quickly comes to our mind is Hungary and Czechoslovakia. I was living in Switzerland in November 4, 1956, when the Russian tanks moved into Hungary. And at that particular time, I had a radio with a shortwave band. All day long, I listened to the Hungarian students speaking in English, sometimes broken English, sometimes good English, hoping the external world would listen. I was marked by that day. I'll never forget it. Never. Those voices pleading for help. The newspapers, right after that, carried a picture of a beautiful, open-faced, lovely girl called Elon Troth. The picture was the picture of Elon Troth on trial for her life because of her part in trying to stand against the external oppression that Marxist-Leninism naturally brings with it. She was hanged on July 1957. Marxist-Leninism is a leap. It's a leap for another reason, or even a more basic one than the one I've given. Its foundation, its philosophy, is materialism. Now, all through this series, we've shown that humanism, man beginning from himself, cannot generate any real values or meaning or any real dignity to man. And here is a system that is built completely and consciously and totally on materialism. There is no place for the dignity of man in a materialistic system. So-called communism with a human face that some of the thinkers in communist-controlled countries have pled for, and some outside of communist-controlled countries have also pled for. It isn't possible. It just isn't possible on the basis of materialism. And yet, strangely enough, the young people and older ones in non-communist countries are caught by the idealistic Marxian-Leninism.
And it was my conviction after examining the different trends in parties and so forth that the Communist Party most held to those ideals. And
the reason is that there's so much talk of dignity. Dignity of man, be treated better.
In order to solve those problems and in order to give life a meaningful and purposeful life to young people.
Where does this come from on a materialistic base? It doesn't. Do you want to know what it is? I'll tell you. And there's only one way to understand idealistic utopian Marxianism, and that is that it's a Christian heresy.
And in struggling against and condemning that which is wrong in the world, and Lord knows there's enough of what's wrong in the world.
Idealistic utopian communism simply reaches over, takes these words, which could never be produced out of materialistic philosophy, brings them back, uses them, separated from the natural results of their own position, and in doing so, catches these who are caught by idealistic Marxian-Leninism. But when Marxian-Leninism comes to power, it's a different story. It's always oppression, and the will of the majority suddenly has no meaning. Not only does the dignity of the individual cease to exist, but the will of the majority has no meaning either. Now we must understand there are two streams of Leninism, Marxianism. They must be kept separate, and we must see these two streams clearly. The first is the idealistic utopian stream. These usually young people, though sometimes older, who have leapt into the area of non-reason to accept Marxian-Leninism. That's one stream. The second stream is the hardcore Orthodox Communist Party members in various countries outside of the communist bloc. Now, we find that the danger is that people who have only the two values of personal peace and affluency, if they seem to be promised peace and affluency by communism, nobody knows what great majorities of these people will do. Nobody knows. More than that, we must see there's a danger in that these two streams of the idealistic Marxian-Leninism and the hardcore Marxian-Leninism Orthodox Party could flow together in a country at a given moment of history and create a situation that would be forever irreversible. And that is a very real danger.
Подобного рода опасность стоит и перед Соединенными Штатами в целом.
This type of danger is before the United States just as well.
The United States has also its marks very much upon it, and no more so in any area than in the area of the generation of arbitrary law. I want to talk about arbitrary law at some length, actually. Man demanded to be autonomous from God and God's revelation. And what this has resulted in is relativity not only in personal and public morals, but in law as law. The nature which men tried to build their law on, as we remember back in one of the previous episodes, just is not sufficient, for the simple reason that nature is both cruel and non-cruel, and as such you cannot build a stable system of law on nature. And what we're left with in the humanist flow today in the United States is purely variable sociological law. Now, by sociological, what I mean is law that is merely based on what some group decides is good for society at a given moment. The man who opened the door for this, perhaps more than anyone else, was Oliver Wendell Holmes. And he wrote in a letter, I'll quote him exactly, "The ultimate question is, what do the dominant forces of the community want? And do they want it hard enough to disregard whatever inhibitions stand in the way?" This was Oliver Wendell Holmes quite a few years ago. And really what it amounts to is purely variable law. Much modern law is not consistent with the law that has preceded it. And as a matter of fact, we must say that the Constitution of the United States today can be made to say almost anything on the basis of sociological variable law. Now, we must understand that a law today is not just variable law, but that the courts are actually making law. They're not only interpreting the law that the legislative has made, but they actually generate law. Now, everybody knows, who knows anything at all about these things, that arbitrary law dominates completely in communistic countries. But what most people don't realize is that on the humanist flow, arbitrary law has swept over into the Western world as well. I'd like to use an illustration. Consider the human fetus, the unborn baby. In January 1973, the United States Supreme Court passed the abortion law. Professor Witherspoon of the University of Texas School of Law writes, "The court held that the unborn child is not a person within the meaning of the 14th Amendment, so as to strip all unborn children of all constitutional protection for their lives, liberty, and property." This ruling by the United States Supreme Court is a totally arbitrary absolute. First of all, it is arbitrary medically. This book was put out with the cooperation of many noted scientists in this field, including some from the United States. It was to inform the British public. It favors abortion. However, it says that the question as to when human life begins is an open question. Abortion, can be carried out before the fetus becomes viable, although when that is in itself an arguable point. It further states that a biologist might say that human life started at the moment of fertilization when the sperm and the ovum merged. The arbitrariness medically of the Supreme Court decision is underlined by the fact that the destruction of the fetus is accepted in abortion. And yet questions are raised as to whether it is right to fertilize an ovum outside of the womb, that is in the laboratory, because then it would only live for a few days. This points up the problem that if such a fertilized ovum were successfully implanted in the womb, that it would have the full genetic potential for becoming a human being. What does this make the 5.5-month-old aborted baby to be? Because it too has the full genetic potential for becoming a human being. Justice White of the Supreme Court, in his dissent concerning the abortion law, said that it is an exercise of raw judicial power, an improvident and extravagant exercise of the power of judicial review. Upon this arbitrary ruling, medically and legally, the abortion laws of almost every state in the Union were set aside. Most people accepted this law, even though it was arbitrary medically and legally, because it was considered sociologically helpful. Why would we not accept laws curtailing human freedom if these were considered sociologically helpful? What we're left with is sociological law, and that is all. And nobody knows where it will end. By this Supreme Court ruling, the unborn child is considered not to be a person. In our own day, there's been a great outcry, and quite properly, that in the past, the black slave was viewed as a non-person. But now, by this arbitrary absolute brought in the humanist flow, millions of unborn children of every color of skin are declared by law to be non-persons. Now, a question has to be asked. In the day when there are no fixed values, why could not the aged, the incurably ill, the insane, and other classes of persons equally arbitrarily be declared to be non-person on the basis of arbitrary law if the courts thought that it was sociologically helpful? In a day like our own, what's unthinkable today might not prove, and probably will not prove, unthinkable in a very, very few years. Now, let's move on a bit. As the Christian consensus dies as the basis of our culture, society does not really have many bases upon which it has the possibility of building. One is that everybody would simply do their own thing. And this has the technical name of hedonism. It means everybody would do what they want to do. But the simple fact is that it is not possible to build a society on everybody doing what they want to do. One could think of a single man living on a desert island. He can do anything he wants to do within the form of the universe. But when two men are on that desert island and they have to have interrelationship, it is no longer possible for every man to do what he wants to do. I often think of the illustration of two men trying to do their own thing, regardless of what anybody else thinks, meeting on a narrow bridge. And as they meet on the narrow bridge, something has to happen. They both can't do their own thing. Everybody understands you can't build a society on people doing what they want to do, on hedonism. All right, then, hedonism is a theoretical basis for society after the Christian consensus is gone. But if it's not possible, what other possibilities are there? Well, there's the possibility of the total dominance of the 51% vote. Now remember, it was Christianity, the Reformation Christianity in the north of Europe, that brought forth the forms and the freedoms which we have, the 51% vote. But I'm talking about 51% vote after there is no absolute by which to judge the 51% vote. There was a time in the days when the Christian culture was more dominant, when the lone individual could stand up with the Bible in his hand and say, "You're wrong," even though the majority has voted the other way. But as the Christian consensus is gone, then there is no absolute by which to judge the 51%. And then this is a very, very different situation. I'll give you a sentence that I wish you'd memorize. If there is no absolute by which to judge society, society is absolute. The heart of the humanist thinking is making the individual man and then mankind the center of all things, his own measure, of making him autonomous. If we're going to live and escape death, not only death individually in the sense of the judgment of God, but death in our culture, in our political life, in our present life, we must turn from that humanist way of making man autonomous, and we must put the Creator at the center of all things. The greatest of all wickedness is putting any created thing in the place of the Creator. And when we turn from this, our feet are turned from the paths of death to the paths of life. there really is only one other alternative left after the Christian consensus is gone, and that is that a single individual or a group will come forth as an elite to give arbitrary absolutes to society. Now, we mustn't think this is extreme in our thoughts, because many people, many different kind of people, have made suggestions in just exactly this direction, that this, they say, is what must come into our present society now that the Christian consensus is gone. One man stands out who said this quite some time ago, and that's John Kenneth Galbraith. And he suggested that the intellectuals, and especially the academic world, and especially the scientific world, plus the government, would provide such an elite. Robert Theobald, at the Second General Assembly of the World Future Society in June 1975, said, quote, "It's naive to deny the necessity for some kind of competent elite," end of quote. Daniel Bell, who's one of the great thinkers of this particular moment of history, has written a book called The Coming of Post-Industrial Society. In it, he says, both government and business has become so technical that the technocrats must become an elite to take over. And he says this is what's going to happen if we continue in a straight line from where we now are. But in it, he gives a most astute warning, a warning that the lack of a rooted moral belief system is the cultural contradiction of the society, the deepest challenge to its survival. Now, what does he mean by that? Well, he means that in this society that we're saying is just, there it is, some sort of an elite, one kind or another, in which all these men and many other thinkers are talking about today. What he's saying is that how are they going to generate any real absolute? How are they going to generate any real meaning? How are they going to generate any real ethic? In other words, you could sum up what he's saying, and brilliantly saying, as that in such a society, there is no absolute ethic to accompany the absolute power. Now, that's exactly what stands ahead of us in this matter of an arbitrary elite taking over and giving arbitrary absolutes to the community. Humanism has found no way to deal with the problem of morals and ethics and values. And Rousseau's romantic utopian theories led to the violence of the French Revolution and to the guillotine. Now, when we begin to talk about an authoritarian elite, please do not think of the model of Hitler and Stalin. That would miss the mark completely. What we're facing is something much, much more subtle, something of which Hitler and Stalin would not provide the model at all. Rather, it's in all probability going to be a manipulative authoritarian elite. A manipulative authoritarian elite. In episode 6, if you can remember back to episode 6, at the end of that on science, we showed many of the suggested forms of manipulation that have been suggested by various people, and some of which are already in practice. We spoke of the press reports of Dr. Kessler's suggestion of chemical agents to rid man of aggression. Dr. Cranty's suggestion of using birth controls in the world's drinking supply. Dr. Clark's suggestion that all political leaders should take anti-aggression pills. Dr. Lee's suggestion that all public officials should take annual psychological tests. And, of course, Skinner's use of reinforcers to modify man's behavior. But there was one that we didn't touch on at that time that really is going to be increasingly important in the days ahead, and that's the problem of genetic engineering. Francis Crick, who with James Watson discovered the DNA code, has spoken out very strongly in favor of full genetic engineering. Quote, "Some group of people should decide that some people should have more children and some should have fewer. You have to decide who is to be born," end of quote. That's only one little part of it, though, because as you read carefully on further, what you find is the call for a group of people, and he doesn't call it an elite, but it certainly would be the elite, who will determine what kind of people we want genetically in the future, and then we'll set out genetically to make them. Now, many of the technical breakthroughs have been made. Now, when people believed, indeed, that man was made in God's image, there was a real basis for humanness. I'm saying humanness, for people being human. But once this is removed, as it has been now so largely removed with the loss of the Christian consensus, there is no reason, once we see people merely as a machine, as not qualitatively different from non-people, non-man, there's no reason why we should not tinker with them. As a matter of fact, Francis Crick in this article uses that word tinker. There's no reason why we shouldn't tinker with them genetically, and there's no reason we shouldn't manipulate them, and there is no reason why we shouldn't control them. And of course, we must think of the manipulatory possibilities of television. It has its own tremendous possibilities.
Violence broke out again last night as some young people were prevented from meeting peaceably in the downtown area by noticeably nervous, if not to say trigger-happy police. Frank Bushman, attorney for the young people who are to be arraigned in court tomorrow morning, pointedly remarked on this overreaction by the police.
I hereby declare this an unlawful assembly.
Late last night, disorder broke out among a small, unruly mob as our guardians of the peace quietly and efficiently, in spite of extreme provocation, restored order.
I command you to disperse, and if you do not, you shall be arrested for refusal to disperse. You have 2 minutes to disperse.
It is important that our courts make an example of these hoodlums and hand out the kind of sentences they so richly deserve.
We staged this scene. We filmed it to show that television can tell any story that it wants to tell. In both versions, the action was the same, and the actors did exactly the same things. However, the camera was placed differently. The editor edited differently, and the announcer told a different story. We would be naive not to realize that what we're seeing is an edited symbol. But the nature of TV is such, we see it with our own eyes, that we naturally look at it as though it were objective truth. For many, what they see on television is more true than what they see with their eyes in the external world. Let me stress, it is always unfair to say the media does this or the press does that. There are always individuals or individual publications, for example, that are not included in the generalization. But the mass media can be used by an authoritarian manipulating government or an elite. The elite gives the arbitrary absolutes, and then not only TV, but all the mass media can be used for manipulation. And a plot or conspiracy are not needed. All that is needed is that the people in the places of influence and those who decide what is the news have in common the modern results of humanism, the modern worldview, which we have considered at length in this series. When the perspective, the worldview of the elite, coincides with some of the influential news carriers, it does not have to be all, then either consciously or unconsciously, the media becomes an instrument for manipulation. Now, what will all these available manipulatory techniques mean in our own countries? I'm not thinking of communist countries now, countries that have gone totally totalitarian, but in our own countries. There will be people who will feel uncomfortable with the increased control and increased manipulation. But there's a dilemma here. It's a very profound one. And the dilemma is that many of the people who speak out for civil liberties are also totally committed to the fact that the government has the responsibility to solve every problem. And there's a natural tension, a torque in these two things as they think both things. Now, as the pressures increase, and they just overwhelmingly increase as time goes on, at a certain point, where is the line going to be drawn? Certainly, if they have only the values, the basic values of personal peace and affluency, at a certain point, their disquiet will be totally submerged. The Christian consensus gave us such tremendous freedoms. Of course, as we've said many times, the basic Christian message is that an individual can be right with God only upon the basis of the work of Christ alone. That's all he needs. And the humanist element is gone out of that. But it carried with it, of course, many, many secondary things. And one secondary thing was this tremendous range of freedom that we've been talking about. Freedom that didn't lead to chaos. But now listen, don't you see that if you can have these titanic freedoms not leading to chaos because of the Christian consensus providing a form, if you remove that Christian consensus as a form, then the very freedoms which have been such a glory and a wonder that we have had from the Christian consensus, these very freedoms then become the hammer blows to destroy everything and to lead completely to chaos. In other words, the good thing becomes the poor thing once the consensus, the form, is removed. Now that's exactly what has occurred. Now, coming and thinking of the United States, we could think of other countries in the Western world, but I'll choose the United States. From what source might the authoritarian, manipulating government come? Most people immediately, of course, think of the administrative side, a president with too much power, but the administrative side isn't the only place to keep your eyes on. Now, it's true that it's harder to think practically of the congressional side bringing forth such an authoritative government, but it's not unthinkable. A public official serving on the very highest level in the United States at one point said a very wise thing. What he said was, and I'm quoting, "Legislative dictatorship is no better than executive tyranny." And he's absolutely right. It isn't a question of from what side of the government the authoritarian manipulative government comes. The problem is it's coming. The fact that the danger is there. And now we come to what I would say is the chief point. With variable sociological law, the courts generating law must not be ruled out as the source of the place from where authoritative manipulating government would come from. Someone has used the term of the imperial judiciary. It's a very good term in our modern setting. And don't forget that as we talk of the rise of authoritarian government, that the words right and left really lose their meaning in a certain way. I'm not saying that they don't have a meaning, but you must see something deeper than this. And that is the right and the left are really only two roads leading to the same end. The problem is not choosing between one or the other. The problem rests at a more crucial point, and that is the elite, the authoritarianism as such, filling the vacuum which has been left by the loss of the Christian consensus, filling the vacuum and forcing a form on society so that it will not go into chaos. This is the real problem. And with most people, the young and the old, committed to apathy, and most of the populations of the various countries being committed to the values of personal peace and affluency, do you think they will stand up at great cost against such a trend, as long as they are promised the affluency and the personal peace? Will they not rather give their position up, give up even their liberties, step by step, one after another, as long as they have the illusion, even the illusion, of personal peace and affluency? The weak humanistic ideals have not been able to provide a base which is needed. Let us remember what humanism is. It's man demanding to begin autonomously from himself and turning away completely from anything God might have to say. And this kind of humanism, this humanism, was not able to provide in the past and the present, nor will it in the future, a support strong enough for society that will still give us freedoms. It's not able to. Do you remember in the first episode, the little Roman bridge? And as I stood there on that Roman bridge, I pointed out that these little humpbacked Roman bridges over many of the rivers of Europe have stood safely for 2 millennia as horses, mules, cows, wagons, people went over them. But if you drove a modern truck over them, the bridge would break. Now that's exactly where the humanist ideals take us. As long as the pressures are not there, it may seem to be really saying something and saying something rather nice. But as the pressures increase, that's a very different situation. And don't forget the pressures are increasing. I can name just a certain number of them. You might think of more. But the ones I'm going to mention are not something for the future. They're already upon us. And these pressures are building up month after month, year after year. The first is the dilemma of economic breakdown, centered in what seems to be the impossibility to control inflation. And economists everywhere are writing on the fact that we haven't found a solution to the control of inflation. And if it continues, it will lead in country after country to economic breakdown. We can think of political terrorism and indiscriminate terrorism as it is spread over the world. This brings a tremendous pressure on people, just a tremendous pressure. And perhaps the greatest of all, the threat of war with the imperialistic, expansionist, communist countries toward the West. And add to this the fear of atomic war. Just a tremendous pressure to give up anything, to give up absolutely anything, if we could just save our peace and affluency. And then there is the shortage of food in the world and other natural resources. And this brings with it the fact that there almost certainly is going to be a redistribution of wealth in the world and a redistribution of power. And this is a tremendous pressure. And any of these pressures, as they're growing, and as they will certainly continue to grow, people with merely the values of personal peace and affluency would give up anything in the light of these pressures. Especially if in the days of our own day, as in the days of Augustus back in the Roman Empire, the things were brought in, the changes were brought in while seeming to keep the outward forms of constitutionality. And with the growth of these pressures, modern man with his apathy and with his desire for personal peace will crush, just like that little Roman bridge would crush under the weight of a 10-ton truck. It's just where we are. Now, what are the alternatives? Well, in the natural flow of things, there would seem to be only two. One, an imposed order. And we spent a long time in this episode and looking back into other episodes about the possibility of this imposed order. Or, in the natural flow of things, just one other alternative. And that is that our society would affirm the base that gave us the form and freedoms in the first place. That is a return to God's revelation in the Bible and as he has revealed himself in Christ. This was the base that gave us the forms and the freedoms. And it would seem as though these are the only two alternatives. Imposed order, or our society affirming the base that gave us the form and freedoms in the first place. But I want to say something as a warning immediately. Christianity cannot be accepted merely as a means to an end, sociologically. It cannot be accepted merely as a superior utilitarianism. Christianity's truth, and it demands a commitment to that truth. It means there is an infinite God who is there, and he has created all things. Things are not a product of chance. This infinite personal God has created the heavens and the earth. He has created the space-time continuum. It means the acceptance of Christ as Savior and as Lord. And when we accept him as Lord, it means that we come to live under the absolutes, the moral absolutes, which the Bible gives, even if it sets us apart, as it did the early Christians, from the surrounding culture. In this place, there are morals, there are values, there is meaning, and very specifically, there's meaning for man in this place. But we must understand that what is involved here is truth, not a truth which is a leap into an area of non-reason, but a truth that gives us a unity of all of knowledge and all of life. And then this alternative means that the people who have this base influence the surrounding consensus, regardless of the cost. Just as the early church in the days of the Roman Empire, they spoke out regardless of the cost. It means we have a responsibility before God, once we have this base, to influence society across its whole spectrum and the whole spectrum of life. And happily, and this is important to think about, Christians do not need to be in a majority in order to influence the consensus. There was a Jew who was a Christian who wrote a book to the Romans in about the year 60. He had previously talked to the thinking people in Greece near the Acropolis at Mars Hill. And what did he say to the people of his generation, the thinking people? He said, your worldview does not explain the existence of the universe or its form, and it does not explain the uniqueness of man. Your thought form does not explain those things. And yet, you refuse, you suppress that which does give an answer to both the existence of the universe and its form and the uniqueness of man. Let me quote from the letter which he wrote. The retribution of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Because that which is known is evident within them. And here he's talking about the unique mannishness of man. Man is different from non-man. Because that which is known of God is evident within them. For God made it plain to them. For the invisible things of him since the creation of the world are clearly seen, being perceived by the things that are made. And here he's talking about the universe and its form. For the invisible things of him since the creation of the world are clearly seen, being perceived by the things that are made, even his eternal power and divinity, so that they are without excuse. He says that the universe and its form and the uniqueness of man speak without conflict, giving the same message that the Bible gives in greater detail. And we must say to the humanist man of our own day the same thing as he said to the thinkers of his day. Humanist man demanding to begin autonomously from himself has no answer for the existence of the universe and its form, or for the uniqueness of man, and yet they reject the answer that really gives an answer. That this God exists, and he's not been silent, but has spoken in the Bible and through Christ, has indeed as a central message that people may approach freely to God on the basis of the work of Christ. But it carries many other things with it. And for this series of studies to which we are now coming to a close, the most important thing is to remember those titanic freedoms which it has given to us. Without these freedoms leading to chaos. And this is our hope for the future. It is either this or an imposed order. People act upon the basis of what they think. The problem is not outward things. The problem is having the right worldview and acting upon it. The worldview that gives men and women the truth of what is.
To start with, how do we keep things in proportion when it comes to dealing with life's problems?
Life has such a limited number of moments in it. I have felt that for a long time, that the time goes by and you can't recapture it. And people, I think, in their relationships in life, especially their marriage relationships, their relationships with their children, are so apt to think that time is frozen, that situations are frozen, that the kind of difficulty that they are in at the moment is a frozen thing, that it's not going to change. And the moment is so soon past. It's quite the other way around. Whether you're having a titanic fight or whether you're having a beautiful moment together, the time isn't going to last long.
Why are there some Christians who seem to always be making claims about healing and perfection in this life and so forth, when we live in a fallen world and Christians and non-Christian alike, being in a fallen world, have to face these things?
I think it's a misunderstanding of the promises that God has given, which do apply to the future. I think we are going to have perfection, and we're going to have perfect bodies, and we're going to have no sorrow, and there'll be no tears and that kind of thing. And I think people have an expectation of an immediate freedom from pain and from any kind of suffering. So it's as if the moment you became a Christian, you stepped into peace, affluence, and perfect health. And I don't find any promises in the Bible there, nor stories concerning, if I could put it this way, the favorite characters of the Bible. You take Paul and Timothy and Stephen and so on in the New Testament, or Daniel in the Old Testament, and you find that the stories which give us such courage to go on are stories concerning a combination of their faithfulness and their trust in the midst of difficulties. So you see Daniel in the lion's den, as I pictured as a very young child.
Have people spiritualized these things, so the impact of the fact they had real problems is somehow softened into this is religious or something?
It seems it must be that there's a kind of a putting off of that out of the reality of day-by-day life, and they don't feel the mud as well as the blood, sweat, and tears, but the mud and the discomfort, the cold, the hunger, the ugliness of surroundings that Jeremiah had in his pit. And they sing, "Great is thy faithfulness, morning by morning new mercies I see," which comes from Jeremiah in Lamentations. I mean, this is Jeremiah's actual praise to God. I mean, it's his verbalization, it's his phraseology as he thanks God. But in the midst of the pit, he's right there in the pit when he's saying it. And they take him out of the pit and in their imaginations. I include myself in that. I've often sung that song, especially before I wrote the book Affliction, thinking of flowers on the breakfast table and orange juice and steaming coffee and croissants and so on, this kind of morning by morning new mercies I see in the midst of something very lovely in the morning. And not at all with Jeremiah. There he was in the pit, having through his memory remembered things that God had done for him and remembered things God had done for other people before him, which is what we're supposed to be doing. If we wake in prison, if our life takes us into concentration camp or some dreadful combination of things such as is going on in starving Africa today, if we are in the midst of that, that praising of God can belong to us.
How have you seen this idea of suffering come together? And just take Dad's cancer as an actual example rather than getting into the theory. How have you dealt with this, Mother?
Right, I'll deal with that. I'll say that one of my greatest preparations for Dad's cancer was your polio. I mean, that was the most difficult. You have well, Francis is older now, but you have had a 2-year-old boy as an only son at that time. That was, before Dad's cancer, one of the worst periods of my life, in the rapidity with which that change came. And people who go through that kind of difficulty with their children or with another member of the family will know what I'm talking about. It's the rapidity from perfect health, perfect balance, to suddenly seeing a disease take hold. And I'll speak of Dad's cancer in a moment. I mean, we all lived through that during the filming time, and we weren't quite aware of it. When your polio hit you, it was a matter of hours that you could almost see, as if it were one of these films that film a plant growing, put it together rapidly. You know, you could see the deflating of the muscles in your leg, and it just seemed unbelievable. But I would say that my occupation with you at that time, and then I'll come to Dad a bit later, my occupation with you at that time in the hotel in Paris, on the train as we came back, and in the months that followed, it was a moment-by-moment, day-by-day consideration of the importance of that moment in your life, as well as in mine, as well as before God and the angels and the thing of prayer and so on. It's a combination of the whole thing. It relates back to that treating each moment as important, because it was important at that time in Paris not to sit down and wail that, oh, Frankie may have cancer, this looks like, polio, this looks like, I don't know of any other disease that would behave like this except polio. Here was a little 2-year-old that needed to be occupied with that you could sit on the bed, you could play. You had wailed, I can't walk, and I had said, well, we'll find out about that later now. Let's have this game, and we played. And so in a sense, that's the way it is all through life. You may say, well, that's different than an older, your husband suddenly having cancer. I would go back to our time of filming, proceeding during the beginning of the cancer, Dad's tiredness in Israel, in that filming when he must have been doing it with cancer. It was day by day encouraging him, trying to do the physical things that would help, whether it was orange juice or whatever, but encouraging him in praying with him as he himself prayed day by day. Lord, I can't do it today, but do it, show your strength in my weakness today. The evidence of the reality of answered prayer is seen on that film. in the 5th episode. It's right there for yourself, for us as a family, for anybody else to see. That day by day, in the face of impossibility, an important thing was done.
Let me just clarify, because we didn't. That's episode 5 of Whatever Happened.
Of Whatever Happened to the Human Race. That's episode 5. Now, had Dad given up, because he's the one that could have given up and said, I can't go on, I really can't go on, there's something wrong with me. Had I, as a wife, given up and been struck with terror and said, now you've just got to get out of here, we've got to go see a doctor, there must be something wrong with you, there would be no episode 5, which just, I'm trying to put things into a framework of all of life and then of eternity as a huge circle around it. Here you have a day, a few weeks. Incredibly important, if that episode is important in making vivid to people the substitutionary death of Christ in the context of Abraham and so on. The wonder of the resurrection in the context of the garden tomb and all that took place there. That could have been wiped out. To me, that's a tremendously vivid illustration of what you're asking.
Let me ask.
How do you treat suffering? You realize that there is something, whether for the hour or the day or the moment, that could have more importance. People may say, oh, well, we aren't making a film, so our lives aren't going to be multiplied on Tuesday, the 5th of October, it's not going to be multiplied. That isn't the point. When you see in the framework of eternity, of God saying that we have no idea of the importance. I mean, there's a battle going on in the heavenlies. Mm-hmm. There is more taking place every moment of every person's life than they can possibly evaluate or analyze. Now, seeing life in that context of there is something important today, and the prayer morning by morning should be, and I'm not just speaking of a pious kind of prayer, but the cry of the heart should be, don't let me spoil, don't let me hinder, don't let me destroy. We could put it in the context of filming. This episode, God, this episode of my whatever it is in your thing for me to do.
How is it that you often hear expressed the idea that if you just have enough faith, you'll be healed of whatever the problem is? And this seems to often lead to a really cruel situation of self-doubt. How's all that come about?
I don't believe most people really take seriously the fall. To me, it's ground into me, all the way down to the depths of my being. We live in a fallen world. It's abnormal. It's not going to be normal, as Mother said, till Jesus comes back again. Now then, I am not surprised, therefore, when it is not normal. I'm not surprised when trouble comes. I take seriously the fact that when the revolt came against God, that everything under the dominion of man with a capital M was spoiled. This is a spoiled universe. I see it that way. The danger, of course, is seeing it all spoiled and losing the creation beauty, losing the glory of life. Life's marvelous. The human relationships, just Edith and myself. That's precious beyond words. There's no way to evaluate the wonder of our relationship through all these years, from the time she was 17 and I was 20 until now. So there's plenty of beauty there and there's wonder there. But at the same time, the world is out of joint. Now, if this is not only a theological proposition to be fought for in insisting on the reality and historicity of the first 3 chapters of Genesis, or 11 or something, if it isn't up there, but it's down into life, it gives you a framework to see things which are very real, which I think is the biblical framework. Now, you do have to say this, that I think there are 3 sources for trouble in a Christian's life. The first one is shown most of all in Job, and that's the battle that Mother talked about in the heavenlies. Our life is too to circumvent it. The way we live in the world's way of living, of looking at life if we're not careful. But in the biblical way of looking at life, there's a vertical and a horizontal extension which removes us out of the merely moment-by-moment human. And the vertical one is that we're sharing in the battle of the heavenlies now in a way that we don't understand. And Job is the big example. People often forget something about Job. When we read the book of Job, we have the first couple chapters, so we know that it was a part of the battle in the heavenlies. Poor Job didn't know that. The heaven just fell in on him. His children were killed, his cattle carried off. He didn't know he was a part of the battle of the heavenlies. We don't either. The horizontal extension, of course,
so
is...
that's one area that we have to take into account.
Of the battle, of troubles.
Okay, and
the second area is that Hebrews says that sometime God does chasten us, and that indeed, we have to consider when trouble comes with seriousness, Father, you're teaching me something. And sometimes we can see very clearly and say, I have to say I'm sorry. But that's very different from making this a universal.
Mm-hmm. And in addition, you would say that's very different than going to someone else and saying, now, fella, you're suffering. What's God trying to teach you?
Nobody ever ought to say that to anybody.
Can you think of anything more cruel than that?
Nothing. I had an example. I learned it with tremendous ferocity in my first pastorate in Grove City. There was a dear woman there with multiple sclerosis. I remember her name. I loved her very deeply. And I loved her husband. They're both dead now, but they're both very fragrant in my memory. And she had multiple sclerosis, and she was getting worse and worse and worse. And she was dear. And I would say a lot of the results there in the Grove City Church came from the fact that in her I had a real prayer partner, with Mother too, of course. So this woman, Mrs. Armour, and her husband, Mr. Armour, both of whom are dead now, really are very fragrant in my thinking after all these years. And I think a lot of the blessing in Grove City came in the fact, not only of my mother's and my prayer times together, but I could go to this woman and talk to her about the troubles in the congregation. And I knew she wouldn't talk. And she shared with me in prayer, almost step by step, just as Mother and I always shared everything. Now, one day, if I've ever seen anybody love the Lord, that woman loved the Lord. And one day I came and she was in tears. And some people who believed this other way had gotten into her and told her she must have the sickness because there must have been sin in her life. And I was furious. I remember Mr. Armour stormed and he said if I could get my hands on those people. Because this woman, here she had this trouble. Now they heaped this feeling of guilt on her until her husband and I were could dispel it. I've never... Now, let me say this firmly. I've never in all my life seen anything more cruel.
Were you angry?
I was furious. I was furious. Really. I'm furious now just telling you about it. My blood pressure's going up. And this was terrible. And it is cruel. And it roots back into this mistaken idea of the fact that we escape the fallen world just because we're Christian, if we're Christian and if we have enough faith. And that just isn't true. One thing I've learned throughout my ministry, and all the way up to when I have found I had cancer in the Mayo Clinic, and then one of the doctors, for example, a fellow by the name of Steve, very dear Christian, said, would you please visit my mother? She's just found today she had cancer. She's read your book. She respects you. She's really very, very down. Would you please visit her? So, of course, I immediately got up and went over to the hospital and visited her. And I remember her first question. It was, after she said how glad she was to see me, et cetera, et cetera. Then she said, why has God done this to me? And that demands an answer. And the answer is God hasn't done to you. And I talked to her about the battle in the heavenlies and Hebrews. But then I came back to what I thought was the real explanation. We live in a cause and effect universe. And the cause and effect is out of joint because of the rebellion. The whole thing's out of joint. So therefore, after talking to her about this, I must say, when I left, she was an entirely different person.
Well, there seem to be a lot of Christians wandering around who feel like second-class citizens. and feel guilty and inferior for one reason or another, mainly because they haven't achieved what they regard as perfection or healing or whatever in some area of their lives. How has this come about?
I would say it's a misunderstanding, and that is that the Bible does not promise us perfection in any area until the restoration of all things when Christ comes back. You see, people read the Bible too simply. In a way, you can't read it too simply, but it's too simply now as I'm describing it. They'll pick out this and they leave that. So Jesus says, anything you ask in my name, I'll give you. Well, if you just take that sounds in this direction, something like this. But then you turn back and you see Jesus himself in the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus himself. And to me, this is one of the great crucial moments of all history, of everything. And Jesus is saying, here I am, Father. If it could be your will, take it away. But don't take it away if it's going to spoil the work I came into the world to do. Now you extend that to Paul. Who's going to say Paul is a man of lack of faith? Or he isn't praying? We know he prayed all the time. He says he did. And yet at the same time, he says expressly he had a thorn in the flesh, and there's no reason not to think that it was physical. None whatsoever. And he asked 3 times to be removed, and it wasn't removed. But God is not a dispensing machine. God is a personal God. And I must allow him to answer my prayers in the light of his wisdom instead of my limitedness.
And that's not a cop-out?
Not at all. Not all. It's rooted in the heart of all things, and that is he's infinite, I'm finite. I'll tell you something. Nothing could terrify me more, and I'm being very serious. Nothing could terrify me more than that I could ask for anything today and get it. Because I don't know enough.
Including for your own health?
Oh, absolutely. Just as much as for anything.
Are you willing to say that as a person who, okay, let's face it, has cancer that's serious enough so it could be killing you?
Yeah, of course.
And you could push a button and say, get me over my cancer. And if you had, quote, enough faith, you know it would work like a machine. Even at risk of yourself dying of the disease, you'd rather have it the other way?
Well, I'd split it, to be honest. If I could wave a wand or push a button and get rid of it, in one sense, of course I'd do it. Who wants cancer? I mean, let's not kid ourselves. It's no pleasure to live with this thing on top of my head all the time. And going up and down, you know what I mean? But on the other hand, more profoundly, I think I can honestly say sitting here that I would rather trust God's wisdom than mine.
What has been your personal prayer in terms of your cancer? What have you told God when they told you that you might have a few months to live?
Well, I prayed that if the Lord would, if it was what would indeed be best in his sight, that he would cure me. Now let me say, I believe God can cure in answer to prayer. We've seen it in La Brea a fair number of times.
Okay.
So I want to stress that.
But what was your personal prayer?
Yeah, but now let me stress it. It isn't that he can't, but that my prayer was, Lord, here I am, and I know you can, and yet here I am, and if it is your will, and that I don't mean that as a religious cop-out. I mean, all I've said, you're infinite God, yeah. I'm finite, etc. I don't know the results of things. In the light of this, really and truly, I want what you know is right and best.
So you've not, in fact, demanded anything?
I never demand anything in prayer.
As if some guy...
Well, now, I'm a sinner too, so sometime I do, but I try not to. I like an illustration that I often use in Saturday night discussion in La Brea, and that is down on the Eagle platform where I used to catch a train all the time, there was a slot machine. You put in 20 centimes, it's the old days before inflation, you got out a certain kind of caramel. You could always do this, but now that's a mechanical relationship. We must remember that our relationship to God is never mechanical. It's always personal. And I must come to God dealing with him as a person and realizing that he knows more than I know. And what I must wish is for him to deal with me in my prayer. And we have a promise, and that is in Romans 8, that the Holy Spirit will take our prayer and to make it into what it ought to be. And I think that's what it's talking about.
Thank you.